The morning sun was still polite enough to hover behind the gables of Flaxborough's Market Hall when Mrs. Hobbins arrived with her prized begonias. The hall smelled faintly of linoleum, polished brass, and that unmistakable undertone of late summer, overripe fruit, and damp wool. It was the sort of day when nothing seemed urgent, and yet everything in town felt suspended on the cusp of proper order. Inside, a small crowd had gathered for the annual Flaxborough Flower and Handicraft Show. The participants fussed over tablecloths and ribbon placements with a seriousness that bordered on ritual. Mr. Fenwick, the secretary of the Horticultural Society, inspected each entry with an air of officious devotion, murmuring numbers and classifications that meant little to anyone else. Inspector Purbright, summoned by a polite note from the mayor, leaned against a doorframe at the rear, his notebook untouched for now. He had a habit of observing quietly, allowing the citizens of Flaxborough to reveal themselves in conversation and tittle-tattle, which, in a town like this, amounted to an extraordinary amount of information. His hat was slightly askew, his coat unbuttoned a look of deliberate nonchalance that contrasted with the meticulousness of everyone around him. The first stirrings of trouble were subtle. A gasp, discreet but audible, followed by a low murmur, slid through the crowd like a shaft of cold light. Mrs. Hobbins, perched beside her begonias, pointed an elegant finger towards the centre of the hall. There, where the floral arrangements were meant to sit in stately rows, one table had been overturned. A delicate collection of teacups and saucers entries for the domestic arts category had crashed to the floor, porcelain shards mingling with the ribboned exhibits. "Oh dear, muttered Mrs. Hobbins, clutching her pearls. How terribly careless! It was not so much the accident that caught Purbright's attention, it was the calm precision with which it had been executed. No teacup had rolled under the table, no saucer had lodged in a corner. Everything lay neatly in a small pile as though placed there by a hand that was neither trembling nor distracted. Mr. Fenwick, naturally, suspected the gardener's assistant, young Mr. Barrow, whose shoes always seemed suspiciously dusty. "I did warn him," Fenwick muttered, bending to inspect a slightly smudged rose petal. "But did he listen? No, of course not." "I never touched that table," said Barrow with polite indignation, a thin sheen of sweat appearing at his hairline. Mrs. Hobbins, meanwhile, had moved to comfort Mrs. Dalloway, whose Victoria sponge lay slightly askew, a casualty of the tumbling teacups. Each person spoke over the other, their voices rising and falling like small waves of indignation, each with their own private certainty of guilt. Purbright made a note of the arrangements, the expressions, the subtle shifts in posture. He did not speak. He rarely did, not until he had the whole picture. Gossip in Flaxborough moved quickly, but it was often the gaps, the half-truths, the tentative admissions that spoke louder than the crowd's accusations. As the hall settled back into the polite murmurs of how dreadful and such a shame, Purbright's gaze fell on a small, overlooked detail. A single spoon, untouched by the crash, lying slightly askew on a side table. It was an inconsequential object, yet in its silent isolation it seemed almost deliberate. By the time the mayor arrived, a commotion had grown around the shattered domestic arts entries. Purbright greeted him with a courteous nod, already piecing together the social geography of the morning, Mrs. Hobbins's moral outrage, Fenwick's officiousness, Barrow's nervous indignation, and the invisible choreography of a small-town scandal beginning to form. The flower show, it seemed, had been quietly interrupted. And in Flaxborough, interruptions were rarely without significance. By mid-morning, Flaxborough's narrow streets and tidy lanes were abuzz with commentary on the flower show incident. Mrs. Hobbins, still gently clutching her pearls, had visited the post office, where she carefully ensured that everyone within earshot knew of the most distressing accident involving teacups and the domestic arts display. The tale grew in subtle increments as she spoke, each retelling adding a hint of impropriety or negligence that might, in her mind, absolve her from responsibility for any minor collision with the smashed porcelain. At the corner cafe, Mr. Winstanley, the proprietor, polished glasses with a rigour that suggested he relished the unfolding drama. "Did you hear about the teacups?" he asked Mrs. Collingwood, who sat perched on a high stool, balancing her teacup like a precarious scale. "They say it was deliberate. A young scoundrel, probably that Barrow lad." Mrs. Collingwood's eyebrows arched in synchronized astonishment. "Deliberate? Oh, one simply can't leave children to their own devices. I saw it myself, though I must admit I was across the hall at the time. Still, the thought of intentional mischief is most upsetting. By noon, the story had traversed the market square, amplified at each retelling. Mr. Pevensey, the railway ticket clerk, informed anyone who would listen that he had it on very good authority that the spoons had been deliberately mislaid in a subtle message of defiance. Whether or not he had any actual evidence was irrelevant. He had a reputation for impeccable conjecture. Inspector Purbright moved quietly among the clusters of citizens, notebook still closed, listening with that peculiar patience he carried like a shield. Each remark, each half-remembered observation, added a layer to the picture forming in his mind. He noted Mrs. Hobbins' moral indignation, Fenwick's officious certainty, Barrow's defensive anxiety, and perhaps most telling, the casual amusement with which some of the younger townsfolk recounted the incident. In Flaxborough, amusement was often as revealing as outrage. At the flower show hall, Purbright paused by the display of flowers, pretending to admire the begonias while noting the subtleties of human behaviour. Mr. Fenwick, flustered and adjusting his bow tie, hovered nearby. "Inspector, I do hope you'll see to this promptly," he said, fanning the shattered porcelain with a blue ribbon. "It is an affront to the society, really. One might think such carelessness, or malice, has become fashionable." Purbright inclined his head. "I am simply observing, Mr. Fenwick. Often the explanation lies in the ordinary, not the theatrical." His voice carried the sort of quiet authority that neither offended nor reassured, just the right balance to encourage disclosure. A soft, tentative cough drew his attention to the far side of the hall, where Miss Grindle, a teacher at the local grammar school, lingered near the handicraft exhibit. She gestured towards a pattern of crumbs trailing from the entrance to the scene of the accident. "I thought it peculiar," she murmured. Not that anyone would notice, perhaps. But there were tiny crumbs on the floor. "I've never seen anyone handle porcelain without a hint of carelessness, or perhaps intention." Purbright filed the observation silently, noting the seemingly trivial detail. In Flaxborough, such minutiae rarely went unnoticed. Their significance, however, was often missed entirely. Meanwhile, the first whispers of social repercussions began. Mrs. Dalloway, still nursing her slightly lopsided Victoria sponge, complained to Mrs. Hobbins that the incident would give the wrong impression about the flower show, suggesting that town reputations might be quietly tarnished. Each concerned expression, each subtle glance, served to reinforce the notion that even a minor mishap could ripple through the social fabric of Flaxborough like an understated earthquake. By mid-afternoon, Purbright found himself gently intercepted by Councillor Tilling, who was fluttering around in a manner only a town councillor could manage. "Inspector, surely you have your eye on the perpetrator. Young Barrow, yes? It's obvious, surely." Purbright, allowing himself a faint smile, replied, "It would be imprudent to settle on the first convenient explanation, Councillor. Often the simplest answer is not the correct one." Tilling frowned, a faint wrinkle forming between his brows. "But it is so. Tidy, convenient, appealing to order at least." And order is hardly a guide to human behaviour, Purbright murmured, drifting towards the rear tables, his attention captured by the same spoon he had noted earlier. Its silent insistence in the midst of chaos held a curious appeal, and he made a mental note to revisit the detail when the hall was quieter. Outside, children ran with baskets of garden flowers, their laughter mingling with the town gossip, spreading fragments of the story in half-truths and exaggerations. Mr. Winstanley called after them, shaking his head, yet pleased at the lively engagement with the day's scandal. By late afternoon, Purbright had quietly canvassed several of the attendees, Mrs. Hobbins, Mr. Fenwick, Miss Grindle, and even the reluctant Barrow listened without interruption, as each narrated events filtered through personal bias, civic duty, or social pride. Contradictions emerged naturally. One insisted Barrow had a penchant for mischief, another swore he had been elsewhere, yet another hinted at the subtle malice of an entirely different attendee. Through it all, Purbright remained a silent observer, letting the town reveal itself. He noted without comment the small hierarchies asserting themselves, the gentle dominance of Mrs. Hobbins's opinion, the quiet sway of Fenwick's officiousness, the naive fearfulness of Barrow, the polite moral commentary of Miss Grindle. Each played a part in the unfolding drama, an intricate choreography that only a careful observer could hope to untangle. As the flower show began to wind down and the townsfolk drifted back to their routines, Purbright lingered by the side tables, notebook finally opened. He made a few measured notes, particularly on the spoon, the crumbs, and the manner in which the porcelain had been displaced. In Flaxborough, appearances could be deceiving, and he suspected that the truth behind the accident or deliberate act would not announce itself in grand gestures, but in the subtle, almost invisible traces left behind. The day closed with polite chatter, careful compliments, and the faintly smug air that accompanies a small scandal in a town fond of its proprieties. The flower show had resumed its placid rhythm, yet for those with eyes to see, the ripple of disruption had begun. Purbright made no immediate announcement, preferring to let the social currents swirl. For the patient observer, the story was only just beginning. The morning after the flower show, Inspector Purbright arrived at the market hall just as the first delivery vans rumbled past the cobbled streets. The air carried a faint hint of damp straw from the town's livestock pens, and the persistent undertone of baked bread from Mrs. Collingwood's bakery. It was an ordinary morning in Flaxborough, the kind that lulled the casual visitor into believing that life here was predictable, untroubled, and singularly polite. Purbright, of course, knew better. Inside the hall, the aftermath of the previous day's disruption was laid bare in careful detail. The tables had been righted, the tablecloths smoothed, and the smashed teacups swept away, yet subtle evidence lingered. A faint smudge on the polished floor, a slight displacement of a ribbon on the domestic arts table, the singular spoon still slightly out of alignment, each whispering hints to those who cared to observe. Purbright began with Mr. Fenwick, who was rearranging a vase of chrysanthemums with meticulous care. "Good morning," Inspector Fenwick said, a touch too briskly. "I trust the damage has been noted. It was most upsetting, truly, to see our annual exhibition disrupted." "I am interested in the details, Mr. Fenwick," Purbright replied, his voice soft, deliberately even. "Perhaps you can recount your observations from yesterday." Fenwick's fingers tightened briefly on the vase. "Well, I was inspecting the entries, as is my duty, when I noticed the disturbance. The cups, the saucers, they were arranged as if toppled by a mischievous hand, yet neatly enough that it seemed almost intentional. I fear young Barrow may have had a hand in it, though I cannot be certain. His shoes were slightly dusty, and he has always shown a certain restlessness." Purbright made a note of the careful phrasing, the tentative suggestion masked as certainty. He did not challenge it, merely letting the words settle in his mind. Fenwick's officiousness often inclined him toward neat conclusions, but neatness in Flaxborough rarely mirrored reality. Next, Purbright spoke with Mrs. Hobbins, who had taken it upon herself to survey the hall early. She was perched beside the domestic arts table, adjusting a ribbon with the air of someone correcting the world itself. "Inspector, it was a most distressing sight," she said, her voice rising in controlled indignation. "One cannot imagine anyone acting so carelessly or cruelly. The children, the flowers, the very decorum of the hall, all compromised." "Did you notice anything unusual before the accident?" Purbright asked gently, observing her hands as they smoothed the ribbon. Mrs. Hobbins tilted her head. "Well, there was a sound, faint, like a whisper perhaps, and the shimmer of movement near the far side of the hall. I dare say it could have been nothing, but you know one never truly knows in these circumstances." Purbright filed the information without comment. A whisper, a shimmer, a nearly invisible movement, these were the elements that often carried more weight than loud accusations. He moved to the far side of the hall where Miss Grindle was arranging small embroidery samples. "Miss Grindle," he said, "would you mind recounting your observations? The accident, I mean." Miss Grindle, nervously adjusting her glasses, cleared her throat. "Oh, Inspector, it is all so confusing. I was arranging the smaller exhibits when I noticed crumbs, tiny ones, leading from the doorway toward the domestic arts table. They seemed insignificant, yet they caught my attention. I cannot imagine they were connected to the accident, but perhaps they were. One never knows what a child may do, or perhaps an adult with a peculiar motive." Purbright inclined his head, noting the almost casual way she placed moral weight upon trivial details. In Flaxborough, such attention to minor irregularities was a form of social surveillance. Finally, he sought out young Barrow, the gardener's assistant, who was cleaning tools in the far corner of the hall. His expression was one of polite apprehension, a mixture of guilt and fear of being assumed guilty. "Inspector," he said, setting down a rake, "I assure you I had nothing to do with it." Purbright allowed him to finish, nodding thoughtfully. "I am merely gathering information, Barrow. Tell me exactly where you were at the time the cups were toppled." "I was arranging the vases in the corner near the chrysanthemums," Barrow said, his voice quavering slightly. "I didn't touch anything on the domestic arts table, I swear it. I was fetching water for the plants, and then I heard the gasp, and by the time I looked, the cups were already down." Purbright watched him closely, noting the consistency of his story and the subtle tension in his shoulders. He did not need to rush to judgment. The young man's fear was as revealing as any confession might have been. As he continued his inquiries, a pattern began to emerge, not of direct evidence, but of human response. Fenwick's desire for order, Mrs. Hobbins' moral vigilance, Miss Grindle's fixation on minor anomalies, Barrow's nervous honesty, all coexisted in a delicate lattice of motive, perception, and assumption. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had a small collection of these observations neatly recorded in his notebook. He revisited the overturned table, now restored, noting again the small spoon that remained slightly askew. He examined the floor, observing faint smudges in the waxed surface, patterns only visible to someone willing to look closely. Outside, the town continued its business. Shopkeepers exchanged comments on the flower show. Postmen carried fragments of gossip with letters, and the subtle social hierarchy continued its quiet negotiation of reputation and influence. For Purbright, the town itself was as much a subject of investigation as the event within the hall. It was in these quiet, methodical hours that he began to piece together the nuanced interplay of human behavior, small-town pride, and understated rivalries. There were no dramatic gestures, no obvious clues, only the layered texture of interactions, the half-truths, and the casual assertions that might seem trivial but were, in reality, infinitely revealing. By evening, Purbright had spoken with each person he deemed relevant and observed the hall in its restored calm. He closed his notebook, noting that the story was far from over. The initial inquiries had outlined the contours of the problem, sketched the participants in careful strokes, and hinted at the subtleties that would later prove decisive. As he left the hall, he allowed himself a faint smile. The town was beginning to reveal itself, and for a patient observer such as he, that was often more than half the investigation. By the following morning, the buzz around Flaxborough had intensified in a manner typical of a small town confronted with an incident that could be gossiped about endlessly, yet never fully explained. In the narrow streets, near the market hall, shopkeepers exchanged anticipatory glances, and the bakery's bell jingled insistently as townsfolk entered to trade conjecture in lieu of bread. The flower show mishap had, for the time being, displaced mundane matters. Even the council's quarterly budget discussion had been postponed, an unheard-of concession. Inspector Purbright arrived at the hall, notebook in hand, noting with mild satisfaction the subtle reverberations of yesterday's event. He found Mr. Fenwick already inspecting the flowers, spectacles perched low on his nose, a blue ribbon draped across one arm. Fenwick's manner carried the peculiar combination of anxiety and righteousness peculiar to those convinced of their own judgment. "Inspector," he began, voice tinged with moral urgency, "I feel it necessary to address the obvious." Young Barrow's presence near the domestic arts table at the precise moment cannot be dismissed. It is the only explanation that fits the evidence, even if circumstantial. Purbright nodded slowly, allowing the statement to linger. "It is certainly a reasonable suggestion, Mr. Fenwick. However, one must always consider whether what appears reasonable is truly so, or merely convenient." His tone was polite, yet his words bore the quiet weight of caution, reminding Fenwick that neat conclusions were rarely conclusive in Flaxborough. The inspector then observed Mrs. Hobbins, who had arrived with renewed determination, clutching her pearls and an air of authority. "I must agree," she said crisply. "That young man has always shown a tendency for impulsive behavior. It would hardly surprise me if he deliberately overturned the cups. One must not be too lenient even with youth when standards are at stake." Barrow himself had arrived a few minutes later, bearing a watering can and an expression that teetered between fear and politeness. Purbright greeted him with an inclination of the head, allowing Barrow to recite once more the sequence of events he had described yesterday. He remained patient, noting inconsistencies that were minor yet revealing the faint hesitation when speaking of a particular vase, the precise way he avoided glancing at Fenwick. Meanwhile, Miss Grindle had taken up a discreet position at the far side of the hall, her embroidery samples arranged with mathematical precision. She observed Barrow in silence, occasionally murmuring a comment to herself about crumbs or subtle displacement, as if cataloguing the scene with invisible annotations. Purbright made a note to review these observations carefully. Small details, though seemingly trivial, often proved pivotal. As the morning progressed, the case took on a clarity that threatened to simplify matters. Townsfolk whispered about Barrow in tones that oscillated between pity and judgment. Mrs. Dalloway, perched delicately on a folding chair, remarked to a neighbour, "I suppose it is inevitable that some sort of reckoning would occur. The boy was always fidgety, rather too energetic for delicate arrangements." The narrative around Barrow solidified into a tidy story. The impulsive youth, the nervous assistant, responsible for a minor but socially significant disruption. To outsiders, it appeared to be a case closed even before further scrutiny. Yet Purbright, as ever, refrained from such satisfaction. He had learned long ago that small-town appearances were rarely reliable. They were convenient, but incomplete. He made a mental note of the precise alignment of the remaining spoon on the side table, the faint smudge leading from one display to another, and the subtle reactions of each participant to the accusations directed at Barrow. These were not contradictions in themselves, but patterns, the tension between public assertion and private observation, the manner in which people responded to the notion of blame, and the social pressures that dictated what could or could not be admitted. By early afternoon, Purbright convened a brief discussion with Fenwick and Mrs. Hobbins. "You both have expressed confidence that the incident was caused by Barrow," he said quietly. "It is certainly plausible, yet I must ask you to consider what else could explain the evidence you have described." Fenwick blinked. "I suppose there could be another possibility, though it seems far-fetched. The cups lay so neatly, and the dust patterns. I cannot see any other explanation. It simply must be Barrow." Mrs. Hobbins's pearls clinked lightly as she adjusted her gloves. "I cannot imagine anyone else. It fits too neatly to doubt it." Purbright allowed the silence to extend for a moment, observing the subtle interplay of conviction and discomfort in their faces. He said nothing more, merely recording their statements. It was a polite, deliberate step, one that set the scene for later inquiry without prematurely condemning the young man. As he made his way through the hall, Purbright paused by the domestic arts display, noting the faintly raised edge of a tablecloth, the gentle tilt of a vase, the unremarkable yet oddly positioned spoon. All of these would serve as points of interest later, small pieces of the puzzle that hinted at a wider array of possibilities beyond the immediate, obvious suspect. Outside, the town resumed its rhythm, though gossip continued to weave its familiar, delicate web. In the bakery, in the post office, in the narrow lanes between tidy cottages, people spoke in half-truths, quietly debating Barrow's culpability. For many, the matter was already decided. For Purbright, it remained a question to be answered with patience, observation, and subtle interrogation. By evening, the hall was empty, save for the inspector and a few lingering townsfolk tidying up. He made his final observations of the day, the careful arrangement of exhibits, the faint smudge patterns, the precise misalignment of a single spoon. Each detail, trivial in isolation, suggested that the neat conclusion, endorsed by Fenwick and Mrs. Hobbins, might not withstand scrutiny. For now, Barrow remained the first obvious suspect, the one upon whom the town's collective certainty rested. Yet Purbright, quietly noting the nuances of behavior, the unspoken tensions and the subtle clues left by circumstance, knew that the truth was rarely so tidy. In Flaxborough, as in all places governed by small-town proprieties and understated rivalries, appearances could be deceptive, and convenience was seldom synonymous with fact. The following morning brought a subtle shift in the air of Flaxborough, as though the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next development. A thin drizzle pattered against the cobbled streets, turning the stone slightly darker and giving the market stalls a glistening veneer. The flower show hall remained closed to the public for minor repairs and cleaning, yet Inspector Purbright chose to visit early, curious to inspect the scene once more in solitude. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of damp polish and roses, with the faintly sweet residue of the crushed Victoria sponge lingering in the air. The tablecloths had been straightened, vases realigned, and the domestic arts area looked nearly untouched at a glance. Yet Purbright's eyes were drawn to the spoon he had noted earlier, lying slightly askew, as if pointing toward something or perhaps simply defying the symmetry of the display. He crouched, studied the floor, and noticed the subtle pattern of smudges that seemed to trace an almost invisible line from the far doorway to the domestic arts table. It was insignificant enough that an ordinary observer would have missed it entirely, yet to Purbright the detail hummed with quiet promise. He ran a finger along the faint dust mark, noting how the pattern suggested careful placement rather than accidental movement. He allowed himself a faint smile. Small towns, he thought, were never as simple as they appeared. The first person to arrive was Mrs. Hobbins, carrying a basket of her latest begonias. She froze momentarily upon noticing Purbright's intense focus on the spoon. "Inspector, are you studying that? Surely it is only a remnant of yesterday's accident." "Perhaps," Purbright said, standing and brushing the dust from his hands. "Or perhaps it is more telling than we realize. A trivial object often leaves the most honest trace." Mrs. Hobbins' eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, merely adjusting her pearls and moving toward a corner of the hall to inspect her floral arrangement. Purbright made a note of her posture, the slight twitch of a hand, the way her gaze lingered longer than necessary on the tables. Every subtle gesture contributed to the overall picture he was forming. By mid-morning, Miss Grindle arrived, carrying her embroidery samples and a bundle of tiny notes she had taken. "Inspector," she murmured, "I thought perhaps these might help. Yesterday I made a small sketch of the crumbs. I mentioned before they were faint, of course, but they formed a line that seemed to point." She unfolded the paper with a delicate flourish. Purbright leaned over to examine the faint pencil lines. Indeed, the crumbs seemed to trace an almost imperceptible path across the floor. It was neither straight nor perfectly circular, but deliberate in its irregularity. "Curious," he said softly, jotting a note. "This may be nothing, or it may be everything." The arrival of Mr. Pevensey, the railway clerk, added further subtle complication. He had a tendency to embellish facts in a way that made them sound important. "Inspector," he said, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might listen. "I've heard whispers. Not direct observation, mind you, but whispers. Some say the cups were moved deliberately to convey a message. I cannot imagine why, but there it is." Purbright nodded, considering the remark with polite gravity. In Flaxborough, the half-formed idea, spoken in hushed tones, often carried more weight than concrete evidence. People were seldom straightforward. Their intentions were filtered through civility, habit, and the cautious desire not to offend. At noon, Barrow arrived quietly, clutching his watering can and looking slightly more composed than the previous day. He moved carefully past the domestic arts table, avoiding the spoon entirely. "Inspector," he began, "I know I've said before that I had nothing to do with the accident, but I noticed something yesterday when I entered the hall early, before anyone else. A vase was slightly moved, not by me. I thought it odd, but—" He trailed off, clearly uncertain whether to continue. Purbright, his pen poised, encouraged the boy with a gentle nod. "Please, Barrow, continue. Anything may be of interest, however small." The vase was at the corner of the table, tipped slightly toward the edge. "I did not touch it. Perhaps someone bumped it earlier, or perhaps it was left that way intentionally. I can't be certain." This tiny revelation made a ripple in Purbright's mind. A minor displacement, trivial to most, yet, in combination with the spoon, the crumbs, and the precise fall of the cups, it hinted at a deliberate hand. He noted the boy's earnestness, the lack of embellishment, the nervous hesitancy traits that suggested honesty. Later, as the town's gossip continued to percolate outside, Purbright walked through the market square, thinking quietly about the intricate web of small-town relationships. Fenwick's officious certainty, Mrs. Hobbins' moral vigilance, Miss Grindle's attentiveness to minutiae, Barrow's anxious honesty, all these elements, coupled with the seemingly inconsequential details within the hall, suggested that the truth lay not in the loud accusations but in the understated irregularities that had gone almost unnoticed. By late afternoon, Purbright returned to the hall once more, noting the interplay of shadows cast by the fading sun the floor and tables. The spoon, slightly off-kilter, caught the light just enough to make him pause. He ran his eye along the line of crumbs, the edge of the tablecloth, the faintly tipped vase, and felt the familiar thrill of recognition. The case was no longer merely about the first obvious suspect. There was subtlety here, careful intention, a precision that could not have been accidental. He allowed himself a moment to smile inwardly. In Flaxborough, the ordinary often concealed the extraordinary, and a seemingly trivial object, a spoon, a smudge, a tilted vase, could serve as the key to understanding human behavior and motive. All that remained was to expand his inquiries, gently and without fuss, allowing the town itself to reveal the deeper currents at play. By the start of the week, the disruption of the flower show had become a topic of mild obsession throughout Flaxborough. In the narrow lanes leading to the market hall, gossip mingled with the faint aroma of baking bread, drying laundry, and the occasional tang of horse manure, creating the town's peculiar olfactory signature. Inspector Purbright moved among the streets with the calm assurance of a man who knew that human behavior, in its subtleties, spoke louder than any overt accusation. His inquiries now extended beyond the immediate witnesses. Mrs. Dalloway, whose Victoria sponge had suffered collateral damage, offered a carefully measured account of her movements during the mishap. She spoke of shadows cast by the tall window panes, the faint echo of a footstep in the hall, and the way the ribbons on the domestic arts table had quivered in the air. To anyone else it might have seemed obsessive. To Purbright, it was a collection of clues disguised as civility. He next visited Mr. Whittington, the stationer, who had been present to deliver certificates and ribbons. "Inspector, I did not see much," Whittington confessed, "though I did notice several people moving about in ways that seemed peculiar. Not improper, mind you, but irregular. One or two of the council members lingered near the back tables far longer than seemed necessary." This added a new dimension to the inquiry. Purbright considered the councillors' involvement, their curious attachment to the flower show, and the possibility that the disruption might have been observed or even orchestrated by someone with a vested interest in maintaining appearances. By late morning, Purbright had convened brief interviews with several additional townsfolk, each revealing a layer of subtle grievance or quiet ambition. Mrs. Larkins, whose knitting had been slightly disturbed by a passing chair, mentioned that Mr. Fenwick's manner yesterday had seemed unusually anxious, almost as if he were hiding something. Mrs. Pevensey, at the post office, recalled seeing Miss Grindle glance repeatedly toward the domestic arts table with a mixture of curiosity and concern. At the hall, Purbright paused near the faint smudges and the singular spoon, noting the patterns that had begun to emerge. There were connections, delicate and understated, between people, objects and gestures, a lattice of possibility waiting to be interpreted. It was precisely the kind of quiet complexity that made Flaxborough simultaneously charming and confounding. In the afternoon, Purbright took a walk along the high street, observing the ebb and flow of town life. Shopkeepers straightened wares with a touch more rigidity than usual, aware that their actions might be recounted later in gossip. Children trailed small baskets, whispering fragments of yesterday's tale as though passing down sacred secrets. Even the dogs tethered outside bakeries or shops seemed to carry a sense of alertness, noses twitching at the sense of disruption lingering in the air. Returning to the hall, he noticed a new entrant, Mr. Tilling, the councillor, who carried a folder of local bylaws and meeting notes. Inspector Tilling said, voice brisk but polite, "I thought it prudent to offer any assistance I might. The integrity of our events must be preserved." Purbright inclined his head, noting the subtle tension in the councillor's posture. Thank you, Mr. Tilling. Any observations you can provide may be helpful. Often, what seems mundane can reveal more than the obvious. Tilling's eyes flickered toward the domestic arts table. I suppose so. I only hope the matter can be resolved quickly. A neat conclusion would satisfy everyone, would it not? The inspector allowed himself a faint smile, aware that neatness was rarely reality. Indeed, he said, and moved to inspect the exhibits once more. As the day progressed, new details emerged in small, almost imperceptible ways. A misaligned chair in the corner, a faint footprint near the door, the way shadows played across the tables, each contributed to a quiet understanding of human behavior, opportunity, and intention. Purbright noted how people responded when asked to recount minor details, their pauses, their careful choice of words, the subtleties of their gestures. By late afternoon, he gathered the information into a mental framework. The field had expanded beyond Barrow, Fenwick, and Mrs. Hobbins. There were counsellors with curious attentiveness, townsfolk with minor grievances, and individuals whose motives were neither dramatic nor obvious, but quietly consequential. The crime or accident was no longer a matter of a single suspect. It was a network of interactions, minor ambitions, and social pressures that all contributed to the tapestry of the day. Purbright lingered by the domestic arts display, observing the subtle smudge, the spoon, the crumbs, and the faint tilt of a vase. Each detail now seemed to form part of a larger pattern, suggesting deliberate acts by someone attuned to the rhythms of the hall. The town, in its ordinary routines, had unwittingly provided the elements necessary for understanding. He left the hall as dusk settled, aware that the investigation had reached a point of quiet complexity. The first obvious suspect was no longer sufficient. He would need to observe further, consider motives, and perhaps provoke subtle responses to unravel the truth. In Flaxborough, every citizen had a part to play, whether knowingly or not, and Purbright knew that the solution would emerge not from the loudest accusations, but from the understated, often overlooked behaviours that defined the town itself. It was on a Tuesday afternoon, damp and overcast, that Flaxborough experienced its second, more subtle disruption, a discovery that would shift the town's suspicions in a quiet but definitive way. The market hall, once again open for casual viewing, had attracted a small audience of townsfolk, curious to see the domestic arts display restored and immaculate. Mrs. Hobbins, as always, was present, pearls in place, and an expression of vigilant appraisal on her face. Miss Grindle had arrived as well, carrying her embroidery samples and a keen sense of observation. The children, now fully aware that the flower show had become a source of intrigue, whispered and darted about, their small voices adding a gentle murmur to the hall's ambient quiet. The discovery itself was trivial enough to an outsider. A vase, previously aligned neatly along the central table, was now slightly tilted, its arrangement of roses leaning precariously. No cups were toppled, no porcelain shattered, yet the subtle shift drew immediate attention. Mrs. Hobbins gasped delicately, clutching her pearls. "Why, this is simply unacceptable. One expects care, Inspector. One cannot allow such carelessness to persist." Purbright approached slowly, noting the tilt of the vase and the precise way it seemed to resist accidental movement. The flowers had been disturbed slightly but evenly, suggesting deliberate intervention. It was the sort of understated disruption that carried far more weight than obvious calamity. Quiet, controlled, yet signalling intent. "Was anyone near the table when this occurred?" he asked, his tone measured and calm, giving no hint of urgency. Miss Grindle shook her head, eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the vase. "I did not notice anyone, Inspector. I was arranging my samples at the far side of the hall. Yet, Something is certainly amiss. The vase was aligned this morning when I checked. Mrs. Hobbins, adjusting her gloves with a precision bordering on ritual, added, "I assure you no one approached it to my knowledge." The hall was briefly unattended while I spoke with Mr. Fenwick. Surely someone must have come in unnoticed. It was a curious development. Unlike the first incident, which had drawn immediate attention through sound and spectacle, this second disruption was almost imperceptible. Yet for Purbright, it was precisely the kind of quiet signal that revealed more about motive and opportunity than dramatic events ever could. He crouched to inspect the floor around the vase. A faint smudge, nearly invisible, suggested a deliberate approach from the far corner of the room, a path that would have allowed someone to manipulate the display without being noticed. His attention shifted to the singular spoon, still lying slightly askew on a side table. The patterns were forming a subtle narrative, almost invisible to the casual observer. Barrow, who had been tidying flower stems nearby, appeared suddenly anxious. "Inspector," he said, voice hesitant, "I didn't touch it. I was at the corner arranging the chrysanthemums as usual. I swear I haven't been near the domestic arts table this afternoon." Purbright observed the young man carefully, noting the consistency of his movements, the tension in his shoulders, and the careful avoidance of the spoon and vase. The behavior suggested both honesty and instinctive caution. Barrow had learned perhaps that proximity could be misread as guilt. As townsfolk gathered, the murmurs began once more. Mrs. Dalloway commented on the inexplicable tilt, while Mr. Pevensey suggested, with the dramatic flair he favoured, that someone might be sending a message through these subtle gestures. Councillor Tilling arrived, leafing through his folder of notes, eyebrows raised in mild exasperation. "Inspector," he said, "it seems that the mischief or perhaps malice is not limited to the first incident. We must consider that the perpetrator is persistent." Purbright remained quietly observant, letting the words settle. Persistence implied forethought, a willingness to engage in repeated, controlled action. The first disruption, haphazard yet deliberate enough to suggest intent, had now been mirrored by this second, almost invisible act. It suggested that the initial assumption of an impulsive youth might require re-evaluation. He allowed the assembly to discuss the matter, listening carefully to the various interpretations. Mrs. Hobbins spoke of standards and decorum, Miss Grindle murmured about minor details overlooked, and Pevensey entertained increasingly elaborate speculations about secret messages or covert grievances. Each contributed to the social atmosphere, a subtle pressure that would shape perception long before evidence spoke definitively. Purbright's attention returned to the spoon and the faint smudges. He traced the trajectory silently, noting how each element connected to the previous incident. The alignment of the second vase, the tilting of flowers, and the pathway left by the slight smudge suggested an understanding of spatial relationships, a careful choreography, and above all, a deliberate subtlety. By late afternoon the hall was quiet once more, the town having drifted back into its routines, though whispers continued to echo through the narrow streets. Purbright lingered, reflecting on human behaviour. The desire for attention versus concealment, the way reputations were defended with meticulous care, and the subtle ways people revealed themselves through minor, almost imperceptible actions. The second incident had shifted the investigation. The neat narrative pointing to Barrow as the impulsive culprit no longer sufficed. There was now a pattern, deliberate yet understated, suggesting a broader field of possible actors. The town, in its ordinary rhythms, had provided the elements necessary to uncover both motive and method, if one had the patience to observe closely and the discernment to see past appearances. As he left the hall, Purbright allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. Flaxborough was revealing its secrets in the quietest of ways, and he knew that patience, subtle inquiry, and a careful eye for the understated would uncover the truth. The investigation was entering its most delicate phase, where small details and human behavior would speak louder than any accusation or obvious evidence. The real challenge, he understood, lay not in discovery, but in interpretation. That evening, after the market hall had been secured, and the last of the town's gossips had drifted homeward, Inspector Purbright settled into his modest office above the police station. The room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock, the occasional rustle of paper, and the distant murmurs of late-night shopkeepers closing up. Purbright leaned back in his chair, pen poised above his notebook, and allowed himself the luxury of contemplation, a methodical meditation on human behavior, motive, and the quiet intrigues that defined Flaxborough. He reviewed the events of the past week in his mind. The first incident, a toppled display of teacups and saucers, had seemed almost trivial, yet it had revealed the town's complex social dynamics. Fenwick's officious certainty, Mrs. Hobbins' moral vigilance, Miss Grindle's meticulous attention to detail, and Barrow's nervous honesty had each contributed to a tapestry of observation, suspicion, and assumption. The second incident, the subtle tilting of a vase, had shifted the narrative entirely. Impulsive mischief no longer sufficed as an explanation. The acts now suggested deliberate intention, careful calculation, and an understanding of social perception. The simplicity of the initial assumption that Barrow had acted alone out of restlessness was giving way to a more intricate possibility that someone, attuned to the rhythms of the hall and the behaviors of its participants, was orchestrating minor disturbances to achieve a quiet effect. Purbright considered the small, almost invisible clues, the singular spoon left askew, the faint smudges on the floor, the crumbs observed by Miss Grindle, and the barely perceptible shift in the vase. Each was trivial in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern that suggested control and forethought. It was a choreography of disruption, subtle enough to escape immediate detection, but precise enough to imply a guiding hand. He reflected on human nature. In a town like Flaxborough, reputations were fragile, social hierarchies were closely observed, and the desire to maintain appearances often drove behavior more decisively than overt intent. People spoke carefully, moved cautiously, and concealed motives beneath layers of civility and propriety. It was within these subtleties that the truth was hidden, waiting for the patient observer to discern it. Purbright's thoughts turned to opportunity. Who among the town's citizens possessed both the familiarity with the hall's layout and the understanding of the social dynamics that would allow such precise, understated interference? The councillors, with their attentiveness to ceremony, Mrs. Hobbins, ever vigilant and morally assertive, Fenwick, with his obsession for order, Miss Grindle, with her precise eye for detail, or perhaps someone entirely unexpected observing from the margins, unnoticed yet influential. He also considered the nature of the acts themselves. They were not motivated by destruction, malice, or even personal gain. They were small, controlled, and deliberate interventions designed to be observed and misinterpreted, subtle enough to provoke gossip, uncertainty, and speculation. The perpetrator's motive, he surmised, lay not in material harm, but in psychological effect. A quiet assertion of influence, a manipulation of perception, a demonstration of control over the otherwise orderly proceedings of Flaxborough. His mind wandered briefly to Barrow. The boy's honesty, nervousness, and consistent accounts made him unlikely as the orchestrator of these subtle manipulations. He had been present, yes, near the scene, but always constrained by proximity and observation, never initiative. The pattern of behavior suggested experience, discretion, and understanding qualities that pointed to someone more embedded in the town's social fabric than the young assistant. Purbright scribbled a few notes on a separate sheet, connecting the faint smudges, the spoon, and the tilting vase with each person he had observed. He considered how each element might be used to provoke reaction, divert suspicion, or manipulate interpretation. The acts themselves were small, almost invisible, but the reactions they elicited were substantial, shaping the narrative of gossip and accusation that had already begun to form. As he leaned back, Purbright allowed himself a moment of reflection on the town itself. Flaxborough was ordinary, unremarkable in appearance, yet beneath its tidy streets and polite facades lay a web of observation, subtle competition, and quiet ambition. In such a setting, the truth rarely announced itself in grand gestures. It revealed itself in gestures, timing, and the careful management of appearances. He considered the next step. Patience would be key. Provocation, if done gently, could reveal the true author of the subtle disturbances. Observation could be used to draw reactions, revealing inconsistencies, discomfort, or unguarded truth. The town itself would provide the evidence if one knew how to watch, listen, and interpret without bias. As night settled outside the window, Purbright closed his notebook, his thoughts methodical, deliberate, and quietly confident. The second incident had changed the contours of the investigation, expanded the field of suspects, and introduced the possibility of motive beyond the obvious. Yet he knew, as he always did, that the solution lay not in hasty judgment, but in careful, understated observation, allowing human behavior to speak for itself. He extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in shadow, and allowed himself the faintest sense of anticipation. Flaxborough had revealed its first hints, subtle but telling. The next step would require tact, patience, and the quiet orchestration of his own inquiries. The town's secrets were not hidden. They were waiting delicately for discovery. The next morning, Flaxborough stirred into the usual rhythm, but a subtle tension lingered in the air. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with particular care, children tiptoed past the market hall as if aware of invisible boundaries, and the gossiping groups in the market square exchanged half-formed opinions, all punctuated by glances toward the hall. Inspector Purbright, hat slightly askew and notebook in hand, moved deliberately among them, observing the nuances of their behavior without drawing attention to himself. Inside the hall, the domestic arts table awaited, its porcelain carefully aligned, flowers straightened, and tablecloth smoothed to perfection. Purbright allowed a brief smile to touch his lips. The stage was set. He would now conduct what he termed a gentle test, a carefully arranged encounter to gauge reactions, elicit unguarded responses, and ultimately reveal the subtle manipulations that had so far eluded formal observation. He invited Mrs. Hobbins, Mr. Fenwick, and Miss Grindle to view the table together, casually remarking on a minor rearrangement. He had made himself a vase shifted slightly to one side, a single spoon left deliberately askew, and a ribbon that had been subtly repositioned. The change was minor enough to appear accidental, yet it carried the potential to draw attention from the observant and the guilty alike. "Inspector, I do hope you have not been moving our exhibits," Mrs. Hobbins said, clutching her pearls and adjusting her gloves with delicate precision. Her eyes scanned the table with a mixture of suspicion and moral vigilance. "Merely a slight adjustment to observe reactions," Purbright replied, soft and polite. "It is often in these subtle shifts that one discovers human nature in its most revealing form." Miss Grindle, adjusting her glasses, leaned slightly forward. "I thought the vase had been precisely aligned. Perhaps I'm imagining it, but it does seem different." Fenwick's lips pressed into a thin line. "Different, yes, but I cannot imagine who would have. Well, no matter. Perhaps it is a matter of perspective." He shuffled papers in his hand, his eyes flicking toward the spoon with an almost imperceptible hesitation. Purbright allowed the silence to extend, noting each small shift. Mrs. Hobbins's hand trembled slightly as she steadied a ribbon. Miss Grindle's gaze flicked toward the far corner of the hall, and Fenwick's expression, though outwardly composed, carried a subtle tension. These were the cues he sought, the quiet tales that betrayed interest, concern, or guilt. He then engaged in a mild diversion, asking Barrow to bring forward a small tray of unpolished teacups for inspection, ostensibly as part of routine maintenance. The boy moved carefully, avoiding the central table, and Purbright observed him keenly. Barrow's posture remained consistent with prior observations, honest, cautious, and anxious, but entirely devoid of the deliberate subtlety that the second incident implied. As the group focused on the tray, Purbright casually remarked, "It is fascinating how minor adjustments can provoke the keenest observations. Even a slight misalignment invites scrutiny, speculation, and perhaps disclosure." His tone was gentle, neutral, yet pointed. The effect was immediate, though quiet. Mrs. Hobbins's hands trembled again, more noticeably this time, and her gaze lingered a moment too long on the tilted vase and askew spoon. Fenwick cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles, a subtle sign of discomfort he could not entirely conceal. Miss Grindle's eyes narrowed, and she stepped slightly closer to examine the table, her body language suggesting intense concentration that bordered on unease. Purbright let the moment extend, observing carefully. Each reaction, measured against prior behavior, offered insight into perception, attention to detail, and the degree to which individuals were attuned to the subtle shifts that had become the hallmark of the disturbances. Later, he invited Councillor Tilling to the hall under the pretext of reviewing the flower show's organization. Tilling approached the table with polite curiosity, but the faintest flicker of apprehension passed across his features when his eyes settled on the spoon and the faint smudge pattern. Purbright noted the subtle quickening of his hand, the ever-so-slight tightening of his jaw, a clue of interest, perhaps unease, yet also of awareness that something had gone unnoticed in prior observations. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had catalogued the responses to his small test. He had not directly questioned anyone about the incidents. Rather, he had allowed the table itself, subtly adjusted, to serve as an instrument of revelation. The reactions, hesitation, minor hand tremors, shifting gazes, and controlled adjustments indicated awareness of more than they were willing to admit. They suggested a consciousness of action and effect, knowledge of consequences, and an understanding of the subtle social levers at play. Finally, Purbright withdrew slightly to observe from a distance. He allowed a moment for the hall to settle, for the townsfolk to converse in hushed tones about the minor changes. Each comment, each gesture, contributed to the accumulating picture. The first obvious suspect, Barrow, remained entirely consistent with innocence. The pattern of precise, deliberate disruption was now linked unmistakably to someone more aware, more practiced, and more attuned to Flaxborough's intricate social lattice. The test had been gentle, polite, and indirect, yet it had produced results more revealing than any direct questioning could have achieved. Purbright noted in his careful handwriting the reactions of each participant, the timing of gestures, and the subtle indications of concern or awareness. In the quietest of ways, the second incident had now been clarified, not by evidence of action, but by evidence of consciousness: who noticed, who adjusted, and who recoiled, even if only slightly, under the weight of observation. As he finally closed his notebook and left the hall, Purbright felt the familiar sense of progress that came from patient observation. The field had been narrowed, the pattern confirmed, and the next phase of the investigation, the revelation itself, was beginning to emerge. Flaxborough's subtleties had once again spoken. It remained for the inspector to translate them into understanding and eventually resolution. The following afternoon, the market hall exuded its customary quiet dignity, the restored domestic arts display gleaming under the muted sunlight filtering through tall windows. For the casual observer, nothing appeared amiss. The vases were aligned perfectly, the ribbons meticulously arranged, and the porcelain teacups gleamed without flaw. Yet to Inspector Purbright every detail carried meaning. The subtle smudge patterns, the slight tilt of the previously adjusted spoon, and the minor, almost imperceptible shifts of the tablecloth all whispered clues he had observed and catalogued over the past days. Purbright invited the key townsfolk to the hall under the pretence of a routine post-flower show discussion. Mrs. Hobbins arrived first, her pearls glinting under the soft light, followed by Mr. Fenwick, whose spectacles caught the sunlight with an almost comical gleam, and Miss Grindle, clutching her embroidery samples as if their presence conferred moral authority. Councillor Tilling appeared last, with the air of someone attending an obligatory civic ritual, oblivious to the subtle orchestration awaiting him. "Thank you all for attending," Purbright began, voice calm and measured, allowing his words to hang in the air like a light haze. "We are here to review the flower show, but also to consider certain occurrences that have been troubling. Minor disruptions, perhaps, but significant in what they reveal about observation, intent, and perception." Mrs. Hobbins' eyebrows arched, a faint tremor of anticipation crossing her features. Fenwick adjusted his bow tie nervously, while Miss Grindle's eyes flicked toward the table, scanning for detail with the intensity of a scholar examining a rare manuscript. "Let us begin with the teacups," Purbright continued. "The first incident was over a toppled display noticed immediately. The second incident, however, was subtler, a vase slightly tilted, a spoon askew, crumbs tracing a path almost imperceptible to the casual eye. Both incidents were deliberate, precise, and controlled." He paused, allowing the observation to settle among his listeners. Initially, suspicion fell upon a young assistant, nearby at the time. Impulsive, nervous, perhaps, easily accused. Yet the evidence, upon careful consideration, pointed elsewhere. Purbright walked slowly along the display, gesturing gently to the spoon and the faint smudge. "Observe these details. They are trivial in isolation, yet they form a coherent pattern. They suggest not impulsiveness, but intent, knowledge of space, timing, and human reaction. The hand responsible is one familiar with both the hall and the town's social fabric." Mrs. Hobbins inhaled sharply. Fenwick's fingers tightened on his ribbon notes. Miss Grindle's grip on her embroidery samples was firm, but betraying subtle tension. "The person responsible," Purbright continued, "was aware of how observation shapes perception. They understood which movements would attract notice, which would remain unnoticed, and how minor gestures could provoke misjudgment. They sought to create uncertainty, to manipulate reactions, all without leaving obvious traces." He paused near Fenwick, eyes calm but intent. "Mr. Fenwick, you have always valued order, precision, and propriety. Yet in your diligence you have sometimes felt the need to assert control, to demonstrate subtle influence over events where others might falter." Fenwick blinked, a faint flush rising in his cheeks. I do not understand, Inspector." Purbright's gaze shifted to Mrs. Hobbins. "And you, Mrs. Hobbins, with your unwavering moral vigilance, possess an acute awareness of decorum. You notice the smallest disruption, the faintest misalignment, and feel compelled to correct it." Mrs. Hobbins pressed her lips together. I only sought to maintain standards." "And yet," Purbright said, turning gently toward the spoon and crumbs, "it was your precision, your insistence on propriety, that allowed you to orchestrate the subtle disturbances, each act adjusting the vase, leaving the spoon askew. Guiding the crumbs was minor, almost invisible, yet calculated to draw attention, provoke gossip, and subtly assert influence over the hall and those present." No one would suspect because it was small, polite, and unassuming. A tense silence filled the room. Fenwick opened his mouth, then closed it. Mrs. Hobbins' fingers trembled slightly. Miss Grindle's wide eyes reflected dawning comprehension. Even Tilling's air of civic detachment seemed to waver. "You see, Purbright," continued softly, "the truth is rarely revealed by noise or spectacle. It emerges in the minutiae, the small gestures, the unobserved motions. In Flaxborough, appearances are powerful, but subtlety is more potent. The first suspect was innocent, guided only by circumstance. The second deliberate act quietly executed revealed both intention and understanding of human nature." Mrs. Hobbins finally spoke, her voice faint but resolute. "Inspector, you are saying, was it me?" Purbright inclined his head with courteous gravity. "Indeed, Mrs. Hobbins. Your desire for precision and your awareness of how the town perceives propriety allowed you to shape events in a way most would overlook. It was never destructive, merely a gentle assertion of control." Fenwick exhaled audibly, while Miss Grindle's hands fell to her sides. Barrow, standing near the doorway, let out a relieved sigh, the tension of wrongful suspicion lifting from his shoulders. Purbright allowed the moment to settle, the truth laid bare without fanfare, accusation, or spectacle. "Flaxborough thrives on civility, observation, and subtle social cues," he said finally. "Sometimes those very qualities are used to manipulate and influence, even unintentionally. Recognition of such influence is, in itself, a form of insight. Today the town has observed and we have understood." The gathered townsfolk nodded slowly, some with discomfort, others with the quiet relief of resolution. The hall, once a stage for subtle intrigue, now stood calm and orderly, its small disturbances accounted for, and its lessons understood. As the meeting dispersed, Purbright lingered briefly, noting the gentle adjustments of vases, the careful arrangement of teacups, and the subtle reassurance that decorum, now restored, carried the weight of truth. For the patient observer, the town had revealed itself fully, through gestures, through reaction, and through the quiet assertion of human behaviour. Purbright finally turned toward the door, hat in hand, notebook tucked under his arm, and stepped out into the fading light, leaving Flaxborough's secrets both exposed and reconciled in the quiet, civilized manner the town demanded. By the following morning, Flaxborough had settled into its familiar rhythm, the gentle pulse of a small town resuming its ordinary cadence. Shopkeepers swept the thresholds of their establishments, children scurried along narrow lanes with baskets of flowers or errands from parents, and the distant clip-clop of horses echoed through the quieter streets. Yet beneath this familiar surface lay the subtle tremors of understanding, the knowledge that recent events had unveiled hidden layers of influence, observation, and social precision. Inspector Purbright arrived at the market hall, notebook in hand, to perform his customary post-investigation review. The domestic arts display stood immaculate, teacups gleaming, ribbons perfectly aligned, and vases upright with painstaking symmetry. Minor disturbances that had once captivated the town were now nothing more than faint memories, their lessons recorded in the quiet understanding of those who had observed or been observed. Mrs. Hobbins arrived promptly, pearls in place, and for the first time without the tremor of subtle calculation that had characterized her earlier visits. She offered a soft nod to Purbright. "I suppose everything is as it should be." "Yes," Purbright replied, his tone gentle but firm. The incidents, while deliberate, caused no harm. They were small, understated, and instructive in their subtlety. The town has seen, and perhaps understood, the effects of careful observation and social nuance. Miss Grindle appeared next, her embroidery samples tucked neatly under her arm. She glanced toward the display with measured scrutiny, then allowed herself a faint smile. I confess I had not anticipated the influence of such minor adjustments. It is remarkable how easily perception can be guided by the smallest actions. Even Mr. Fenwick seemed quieter than usual, a mild flush of awareness crossing his features. He adjusted a ribbon with careful hands, perhaps in acknowledgement of the lessons imparted by the delicate orchestration of events. "I suppose one learns patience and attention in unexpected ways," he admitted, voice low, almost reverent. Barrow entered from the side door carrying a small watering can, and for once he moved without the shadow of suspicion that had clung to him since the initial incident. Purbright gave him a courteous nod, acknowledging both the boy's innocence and the relief that his name had been cleared through observation, inference, and subtle deduction rather than overt accusation. As the town's residents dispersed, Purbright took a moment to walk through the hall alone, tracing with his eyes the faint patterns that had once been so telling: the smudge along the floor, the slight tilt of a previously adjusted vase, and the singular spoon now restored to perfect alignment. Each detail had been a piece of the puzzle, trivial individually but collectively forming a portrait of intention, perception, and understated control. Outside, Flaxborough breathed again, its streets alive with ordinary commerce, laughter, and gossip, now tempered by reflection. The flower show, once a stage for subtle disruption, had returned to its quiet dignity, carrying with it the lessons of careful observation, social influence, and the gentle art of human behavior that Purbright had so meticulously chronicled. Purbright returned to his office, the soft ticking of the clock echoing in the quiet room. He placed his notebook carefully on the desk, reflecting briefly on the rhythm of the town, the interplay of civility and influence, and the understated resolutions that defined life in Flaxborough. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public recriminations, only a city restored to its ordinary order, subtly reshaped by the lessons of minor, deliberate acts and the patience of observation. He poured himself a cup of tea, savouring the faint aroma, and allowed a quiet satisfaction to settle. The town had resumed its routines, relationships remained intact, reputations preserved, and yet each participant now carried with them an awareness of subtlety, perception, and social nuance. Flaxborough's balance, delicate as it was, had endured, strengthened by understanding rather than upheaval. Finally, Purbright leaned back in his chair, pen poised for the next case, notebook closed, and the satisfaction of a resolution achieved through patience, insight, and subtlety warming his thoughts. The market hall, the town, and the residents themselves had quietly revealed the patterns, motives, and behaviours that lay beneath appearances, and life in Flaxborough continued steady, observed, and orderly once more.